Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. I know that you might have heard about SolidJS, the reactive framework that's coming to market. Everyone is hyped about it, and you probably are excited too. This is part one of the two-part video in which we are going to build a REST API client that actually makes API calls and shows you the data. And it's going to be super fun. Before we start the tutorial, I would like to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Rapid API. And you can check it out by going to codewithSN.dev/RapidAPI, which is a hub of amazing APIs that you can use. So if you're thinking about a passion project or a really quick prototype, for example, for a hackathon, you can go ahead and check out their free APIs. For example, the free SMS API. You can check different weather APIs or scoring APIs even, and then you can make use of it. And what I really like about Rapid API is this UI and the UX that allows developers to quickly get started. So you get all the options for which language you're going to work in, and you can copy the code directly from there. So you don't have to be worried about how to actually work with the API and just focus on your business, which I absolutely love. I also created a video about this scoring API, and I ended up creating my own API that I actually was able to sell on the Rapid API Hub, which is an amazing thing. So if you are looking into passive incomes, watch this video and also learn how to create an API for selling it and to set it up on the Rapid API Hub. Now, just a heads up, what we are building today with SolidJS is highly inspired by the Rapid API Studio, which allows you to make HTTP calls right in your browser and which is very intuitive. And that also actually made me realize how much effort and work they have put into building this, because I have only implemented a fraction of this and it was really interesting and challenging on how this was implemented. So this is how it looks in the end. You can make the API calls, but I'm going to talk about that more in just a bit. So before we get into the actual video, I would highly appreciate that you subscribe to the channel if you have not already, so you don't miss the notification for the next part, which is going to finalize this video, and like the video in the end if you found this useful, and let me know in the comments what should I build next with SolidJS or any other framework that you prefer. So without further ado, let's get started. So first of all, let's have a look at the final product, and we are only going to do a part of that in this video. So we have a REST API client here, and what we do here is that we have a list of requests that you can see here. Then we can create a request just like this. For example, I could do a new request without even the URL, and I can create a new request, and the UI already switches to that. I can make the request by clicking the send button, and you can see that we get the response here. We also get the response headers from the server, and we can now explore the output just like this right within our web application. And I can also go ahead and I can delete those requests. But before that, I'm going to show you that this is actually preserved. So if I refresh the page, you can see that we still see these three requests because this is being stored in the browser, and that's super cool. Now I can delete this, and you can see that if I refresh again, we only have these two remaining. So that's pretty much it. That's the entire application. And in this video, we are going to work on listing the requests, adding a new request, and also deleting requests. And this is going to involve a couple of things like state management, how to use solid forms, and whatnot. So let's create a new project and let's get started. So what I want you to do is open your terminal and then type npx digit solidjs templates ts, and then you're going to provide the name as solid rest client app. Now notice that we are using the TS template, which means we are working with TypeScript in our application. So we are not going into the blind and breaking things just because we don't know how things work. So once you do so, it's going to create the folder, it's going to install the dependencies, or actually it just clones it and doesn't install the dependency. So now you should open this into your VS Code. For this video, we are using VS Code because I'm going to provide you some snippets that you can use while following the tutorial, which would make things much easier for you. So open this into VS Code by typing code, and then you can just say solid rest. So essentially you can open it directly in VS Code, but you can also use this shortcut as you can see here. Now that we have this open in our VS Code, I'm going to open the terminal, and now I'm going to install the dependencies. As you can see here, we don't have a node modules folder here, so you can quickly go ahead and do npm install. I have pnpm installed, and I'm going to use pnpm. If you want to install pnpm, you can just run npm install -g pnpm. And pnpm is essentially a package manager, which is much faster than the normal npm. So once you have installed pnpm, you can basically just run pnpm install, and this would install all the dependencies for you. And once you are done, as you can see that this was really fast. And once you're done, you can quickly go ahead and run pnpm run dev, and this should start the Vite server for you. And this is also a very fast process, and I absolutely love it. So if you go to your browser now, you're going to see this exact app, which is out of the box app from SolidJS. And the first thing that I want you to do is to work with Tailwind CSS. But even before that, you should copy the snippets that I've provided. So if you go to the link, and the link should be in the description of this video, you're going to see this SolidJS tutorial snippet JSON. You can click the raw, and here you can just right click. I'm using an extension, so if you just see the raw, you can right click and save as, and then you can save this as a JSON file within your downloads folder. Once you've downloaded this, I want you to go to your VS Code and then download this extension, which is called snippet. This is by Devon Ray, and obviously the link is in the description of this video. So once you have installed this, you should be able to see this snippets here. Then what I want you to do is go to your snippets, or actually what you can do is in your VS Code, you type or you press Control Shift P, or if you're on Mac, then Command Shift P, and then you can type snippets. And once you do so, you should be able to see this import snippets. And once you do that, you can select the SolidJS tutorial snippets, and once you double click, it should say snippets imported successfully. And now you can just refresh and see if your TypeScript React has all these snippets, they're prefixed with SJS. Now that we have this, let's implement Tailwind CSS in the project. And to set up Tailwind, you can go to tailwindcss.com, click get started, and then here you have framework guides. Inside here you have SolidJS, and these are the instructions that you need to follow. So we have already created a project, so we don't need to do that. This is where we would start. We are going to start with installing these packages, and we are then going to initiate Tailwind CSS configuration. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to go to my terminal, stop the server, and then I can run this command with pnpm. So I am going to say pnpm install, and here I can say -- save dev. I'm not really sure if the -d works, so I'm just going to run this for the safe side. And this will install Tailwind CSS in the project. Once I'm done, I'm going to copy the npx Tailwind CSS init p, and I'm going to run this in the terminal as well. All right, now you can see that it creates a file tailwind config.js, and I'm going to open this to show you what it looks like. So here you can see that it has the content array empty, and Tailwind basically needs this array to make sure that it knows which file would contain the Tailwind CSS classes. So this needs to be updated. So if I look at the guide, this is what I should have. So in the content, I should have this entry which says any TypeScript, TSX, JavaScript, or JSX file in the source folder should be considered. So I'm going to go ahead, and in the content, I'm going to just paste this, and I'm going to remove the comma. Now that I've done this, I need to include these lines in the index.css. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to go to source and index CSS, and at the very top, remember this, these lines should always be at the very top of your index CSS file. So I'm going to go to my terminal and run pnpm run dev. And now if I go back to my Solid app, I can actually manipulate this and use Tailwind CSS. Let's try that. So I'm going to go to my app TSX, and here you can see that we have this p tag which says edit code. So I'm going to just go here and add a class here, and the class that I'm going to add is text, and then I can say dash, and I can say 5xl. And if I save this, you can see that now this is much bigger. If I remove the class and show you again, you can see that this is much smaller. So our Tailwind CSS classes are being applied. I could also go ahead and change the color. So I could say something like text, red, and maybe let's say 500. And if I do this, you can see that it instantly shows that. So our Tailwind CSS configuration is good. Now we are going to actually modify the font that we are using. So if I inspect this right now and show you the HTML style here, you can see that the font family by default is UI sans serif and whatnot. So we are going to use the Nunito font because I love it. So what I want you to do is go to your index.html, and here just after the title, you can start typing SJS, and you can see that it automatically tells you to use this Nunito. And if you click it or just press enter, this will add these lines of code. So we are essentially adding a couple of links here. So first of all, we are linking with the Google APIs, so we can fetch the font instantly or very fast. And then you can see that here we are using the Nunito font that we are adding with a set of font weights like 400, 500, 600, and we are using display swap, which is a new CSS property that quickly swaps or uses the default font and then swaps it as soon as possible. So now that we have added those, it wouldn't still show up in the UI. Because if you can see right now, even the HTML uses the UI sans serif. So let's update that in the index.css. So I'm going to go to my index.css, and where it says font family, I'm just going to add another entry here, and I'm going to call this Nunito. And if I save this, now you can see that it should use the Nunito font out of the box. So now if I inspect this and go to computed, you can see that the font family by default is Nunito. So I can actually change this and you would see the difference. You can see how rounded these edges are of this font, and that is what I really like. And if I reset this, you can see that now they're pointy. So we are actually using the font Nunito after the change right here. There you go. Now we are also going to use the Ion icons or the Ionic icons in our application, for example, for the delete button and for the add button. So let's add that as well. One thing that I would like to mention is that once you have imported the snippets, you might want to reload or restart your VS Code, because sometimes you may not be able to see the shortcuts working, and that's probably because you just need to turn it off and turn it back on. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say SJS and Ion icons. So you will notice that it also does something similar. So it essentially adds two things. It uses the script to include Ion icons JS and ESM JS, and this is what we want, so we can use Ion icons. And once you have done this, we are good with both the font and the icons. Now that we have this, we are going to implement ESLint, so our code is a bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a new terminal, and our server is running into a different one, and I'm going to do npx ESLint init. And this will essentially initiate an ESLint configuration for us. Once you do so, you're going to make sure that you are using the ESLint RC option. So here, I'm just going to say yes for this. And now you should be selecting to check syntax, find problems, and enforce code style, because that's what we want. And here we are saying that we are going to use JavaScript modules, imports, and exports, and then none of the frameworks. And then does our project use TypeScript? Absolutely, yes, it does. And it will run on the browser. Do we want to use a popular style guide? Yes, we are going to use the standard style guide out of the box. And here you can see that which file do we really want. So we are going to use the JSON in this case. But once the file is created, we are going to change that to something else. So just say yes and use pnpm for installing it. Once you've done that, you would see that this is missing a couple of dependencies. So it's missing the TypeScript ESLint parser and another package. So actually it's just the TypeScript ESLint parser. So you should be now running this command, pnpm add save dev ESLint plugin solid and TypeScript ESLint parser. So just have a quick look at this and run this command to install the relevant dependencies, and then it will not cry anymore. Once you have done that, you should look at the file that is created. This is called eslintrc.json. This would ensure that if you have the correct extension in your editor, in this case it's VS Code, you're gonna have to install the ESLint extension to make it work with your code. And once you do so, then you're gonna be essentially seeing if there are any errors in the files that you're working with. So make sure that you install the ESLint from Microsoft, and once you do so, it should all be good. One thing that I would like to enforce here is that you have to update your ESLint RC JSON in order to work with solid rules, because then you can enforce like reactivity should be there, and there are a bunch of solid rules that makes it easier for developing with SolidJS. In this context or in this video, it's not really helpful, but if you really want to work with a SolidJS application for production, these would come in handy a lot. So what I'm going to do is show you, after zooming out a bit, this is the configuration that I use. So in this, you can see that we are using the env browser true, and we are using the parser TypeScript ESLint parser that we wanted to use. The plugins that we are using are solid, and then it is extending the plugin solid TypeScript. This is very important because this is required for ESLint to actually tell you if something is not really good in your code when it comes to SolidJS. Alrighty, enough configuration, let's actually write some code. So first of all, what we want to do is we want to be able to write some header. So you saw in the beginning that we have a header at the top, and then we have a bunch of routes. So we are going to implement routing now. So first of all, you go ahead and create a new folder inside source. You call it components, and here you create a new file. You're going to call it navbar.tsx. So remember that we are using SolidJS with TSX or TypeScript. So we are going to create TSX files every now and then. And now you're going to type SJS, and here you're going to say SJS dash navbar. And once you do so, you can select this Navbar TSX. Sometimes the snippet also adds what you were typing before, so you can just remove this. And now you can see that this is an import with some really basic HTML. So what we have is a bunch of HTMLs that we could use. Now, arguably, you could use divs here, but I would rather change this to header. So we are using semantic HTML and not just using divs all way long. Now that we actually have the navbar, we need to implement routing into SolidJS. So for that, we are going to have to open a new terminal again, and we are going to install a package called Solid App Router. So you can type here pnpm and then add and then solid-app-router. And now you go to your app tsx, and in here you're gonna add routing. So instead of all this code that we have inside this return statement in the app, you can actually remove this, and then you type here sjs and then you can say app router. So select this one which doesn't say final, so this one, and then you will see that we have a bunch of imports or a bunch of things working here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to import these values or these components like router, routes, navbar, because they are not there yet. So I'm going to import this navbar as well. And then we are going to import, or I can actually say add all missing imports, and this is going to import everything. Now I'm going to remove this logo. We're not using that. And now let's have a look what just happened here. We have imported hash integration, route, router, and routes from Solid App Router. We also have imported navbar. Now, what we do is at the top of our application, we use this router component, which uses the hash integration, which means that our URLs in the address bar would have hashes to them, which is the hash strategy. Now you can see that here we have this div, which contains the navbar, and we have routes defined here. For each route, we have a component defined directly here. So you can either provide this variable or this prop an actual component or a component function, or you can just define it right here. So in this case, we are saying, hey, the root component is actually going to display this text called home component, and the about page or about route is going to display this about component. Now notice that our navbar already has the links, which is that the logo takes you to the home page and the about link takes you to the about page. So let's try this out in the browser now. So if I go to my browser now, you can see that we have got this home page here and we have this about page. By default, when I'm on the home page, you can notice that at the top there is the hash strategy being used. And you can see that if I click the about page, I see the about component. If I click home page, I go back to the home component, and that's how it works out of the box. Now let's actually create the home and about pages so we can see how it should really look like. So I'm going to minimize this window again, and I'm going to create two pages. So I'm going to create a folder named pages, and inside I'm going to create first the home.tsx. And then I'm going to also create the about.tsx, and these are going to be the pages for us. So first let's create the about.tsx. So I'm going to just say here sjs about comp. And if I choose this, you can see that it's a really simple component which has a div, and then it also has a header. Now I'm going to go to my home tsx, and here I'm going to type sjs home component. And this essentially creates a couple of things for us. So if I just save this, let's see what this entails. So it contains a bunch of elements. It has a div. Then inside there, you have a heading which says REST request. Then it has a button that allows us or should allow us to create a bunch of requests. And then it has this outlet. So we are not going to use the outlet in this video, but this is going to come in handy later on. So this is just a bunch of simple HTML, nothing fancy. Now that we have the home, TSX, and about, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace these hard-coded components in the app TSX with the actual components. So what I want you to do is to delete all of this and then type sjs app router final, and whatever comes out of it, you basically format it, and then we are going to import the about and home component. So you can do add import from pages, and similarly, I'm going to import this as well. Now notice that instead of using the component property like before, so before we had something like this, we were defining the component directly here, but instead now we are providing an element, and the element should contain the actual SolidJS component in this case. Notice that we have some commented code here. We're going to use that in the next video, but so far it's the same thing, but actually using the components. So if I go to my browser now, you can see that there is some change here. First of all, you can see that there is a really nice padding that you can see here. And then this says this is about. And if I go to the home page, ooh, look at that. We have some UI that should essentially work. So in this case, you can see that the REST request heading is there. If I click this button, I just see a message to be implemented, which this is. And that's pretty much it. A simple layout for a not so simple application. Now comes the interesting part. In order to work with the requests here, and requests are obviously objects, and you know that JavaScript essentially is an object-oriented language, so everything is considered an object there. It may not follow the traditional OOP concepts, but it has all of the OOP concepts that you would require, especially when we are working with TypeScript. So in order to define or talk about a request that you are making to a server and getting some response, we should have some types or interfaces for the request and also the response. So let's create those interfaces now. So we are going to go to source, create a new folder. We are going to call this interfaces. And here we are going to create a new file. We are going to call this rest.interfaces.ts. And inside here, you start typing SJS. You're going to see this REST interfaces and you just hit enter. Now, if you have a look, I'm going to close this one because these two are very important and these two are the only ones that are exported from these files. So we have two things here. We have the iRest request and we have the iRest response. And these requests and responses are what we are going to deal with. So each request that we create in our REST API client has an ID, has a name, has a description, and also has a request object. We're going to have a look at that in a bit, but each request is differentiated by its ID, has a unique name and a description. And similarly, we have the response. It doesn't have to have a unique name though, but the ID should be unique. So for the response, we could have any sort of data that comes from the server. It could be a JSON, it could be in HTML, anything at all. Then it should have a status that could come from the server, and then it should be a lot of headers as well. And I believe you could either use any here or a record of string. It's up to you. I'm going to keep it simple for now. So the request object here is what contains the actual stuff. So each request that we are going to make to the server contains a method. It would be get, post, patch, delete. I've kept it a string for now, but if you want to go one step beyond, just use the specific types like get, post, and patch and delete. And in here, you have a URL that's going to be a string. The body can be essentially anything. And then we have a bunch of headers. In this example, we are not going to go through the headers because it makes things a lot more complicated, but we are going to work with these three quite a lot. Now that we have the interface defined, it's time to actually work with some data. So we should probably create some dummy data that we can work with. So I'm going to go to my home TSX, and in here we are going to create some dummy data. So right after the component function where it starts, you can type SJS and you're going to go ahead and you're going to say dash requests array. And when you do so, you're going to see a lot of code that pops up here. So make sure to import this interface from the REST interfaces. And now let's have a look at the code. You can see that each request item here or each request object, because this request is an array of the requests that we have. And here you can see that each request has exactly what we had in the interfaces. So it would have an ID, a name, a description, and then a request object. So it has an ID, a name, a description, and a request object. And the request object looks like the iRequest interface, which contains a body URL method essentially. So it contains a method, URL, and it doesn't contain a body because this is a get request. But if you look at the post request, it contains a body, which is a stringified value here. So you will notice that we are also using headers in this example. But as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to use it in this video. Perhaps the next part of it would contain this. So now that we have these requests, let's actually render them in the UI. So what I want you to do now is right after this button where we have this flex justify between py4, I'm going to just go right after this, and then I'm going to type sjs request list element. Once you do so, you're going to see that we are essentially having a div, and then inside, or this list essentially has a for loop that's running. So I'm going to actually import everything that we have. So the for and the link here, and let's study what's happening here in this case. So the for component, which comes out of SolidJS, basically takes an array. You pass the each prop, or you pass the request as an each prop. If you don't have a value of the request, then it runs this fallback, and whatever you provide here as an element or the HTML, it is going to render this if the requests do not exist or if there are no requests to render. For example, if you have an empty array, then this is what you would see. Then inside we are running a loop. So this is how the SolidJS syntax work. So inside the for, you basically run this JavaScript and you essentially provide a function which gets each item or each request one at a time. So for each item, for each request, we create a link tag. So when you click a particular request, you navigate to its page. This is not going to work in this part or this video, but it will work in the next video. Then you can see that we just have a div wrapping inside, which has some styling. Now this class list here essentially dictates if the current list item is the active request which is being viewed right now. So if I go to the final app here, if I go to the detail page here, this is what happens. So it turns everything into purple. And if this is the active item, then it is highlighted automatically and we are handling this via the class list. Then it just shows the name and the request method and the URL. So now if we save this and try it in the browser, you can see that now we get the list right here. So if we have a look at the final UI, this is how it looks. It's quite close to what we see here. It doesn't have the delete buttons, but still the list is right there. And it doesn't right now take care of the detail page. If you click it, it goes to a particular page, but it doesn't really know what's happening there. So we're going to implement that in the next video. But for now, you can see that we got a list of requests that we can see right here. This is good. Now, what we really want to do is to be able to also store this into the browser. So if we end up creating more requests or deleting requests, then we can persist that within the browser, because here it actually does that in the final UI. And right now, if I go to my inspector and if I go to application and in local storage, you can see that there's nothing here that is currently being saved unless I talk about this one. So in the final application, if I go to my application right here and go to local storage, you can see that we have these requests which are being saved in the browser just like this. And for this, we are going to use something called solid primitives, which is a set of really good SolidJS examples and also packages. So in here, we have a lot of primitives that we could use, but we are going to use the storage primitive, which essentially is sort of a persistent layer which creates a storage. It uses the available persistence like local storage, IndexedDB, and provides a local storage type layer for us to save things in the browser. So without going into too much documentation about it, let's actually install the package and use it. So I'm going to go to my terminal again, and now I'm going to add the package by just typing pnpm add solid primitives storage. Once you do so, you're going to have this installed and you would require to actually restart your server. So you can go to your first terminal and then stop it and then start it again. Now what I want to do is I want to have a file which interacts with the storage and that handles everything when it comes to saving things to the store and also managing the state within the application, because we are going to be navigating to different routes, getting a lot of value. So we really need a store here. And SolidJS has something called signals that are very reactive, and that is sort of the selling point of SolidJS as well. So the solid primitives not only save things into the storage, it also acts as the signal that you can work within your application for state management. So for that, what we are going to do is inside the source folder, we're going to create a new file. We're going to call it store.ts. And inside here, you're going to start typing sjs and you can see rest store here. So it would paste a bunch of things, but if I kind of collapse this, it's actually very simple. Let's have a look at what's happening. So first of all, we are importing the createStorageSignal from this package, which is creating the storage, but also creating it as a signal so we can use it within our application for state management. So how you create it is quite similar to if you have used React. It is sort of similar to the useState hook, but the syntax is a bit different. So what you do is you have exported a const, which is a REST request, and this is a function that you would call to get your data. And then this set rest request is also a function that you will provide the value to update it. So here you can see that we are using the create storage signal with a generic, which is a generic, and this requires this type. So we are telling the create storage signal that we want to create a storage for rest request or iRest request. Then we are naming it. So when this saves to the local storage, this is the key that it is going to use for saving to the local storage. And then we provide this an initial value as the second parameter. So this array is going as a second value. And then the third parameter is a function that we can use to serialize or deserialize it, because you can have multiple type of objects. But this one is pretty simple. For example, when we use the deserializer, which means that we are getting the value from storage and we are providing it back to our application. So what we do here is that once we got the value, we parse it and send it back. And if there's no value in the storage, then we return an empty array. If you have worked with to-do applications in the past, which I hope you have, then you might have used a similar syntax, but in a different way. In this case, it looks like this when it comes to deserializer. And then when we save to the storage, we essentially take an array of value or array of rest requests, and then we just stringify, because in the local storage, you save strings. You cannot directly save objects. So we are converting this whole array into a string, and then we are saving that into our storage. And that's what the store looks like. So when looking at the code and understanding how it really looks, I think it makes much more sense on how this works. Now that we have these requests here, instead of using a hard-coded request array here in the home, we are going to rather use the signals. So I'm going to actually remove this, as you can see. And then instead of this request, which I've just removed, I'm going to rather use the requests signal. So I'm going to say requests, and here, or actually this is called rest request. So I can use rest request, and you can see that we are importing this from the store. So as you can see here, I said that this is a function or an accessor. So you need to call it via the parenthesis, and this would either provide with an array or null, depending on whatever is there. So now that we have this, we can just save this and try this out. And I'm going to remove the rest request from here because we don't need it at this moment. So I'm going to save this. And now if I go to my browser and refresh, you can see that not only we see these on the UI, but we now also have them within our application. And this is the app that we have worked on, and this one is the final application. So now both of them actually have the request being saved. And if I change anything here, this would also reflect in my storage or in my local storage in this case. So we have a really nice package that is binding our front-end state that we are using within the app on runtime, and also storing that within the storage, so we don't have to do a lot of efforts, and this is super cool. Now we are going to do some fun things. We are going to implement a form that can actually create a new request and show this on the UI. So I'm going to click this button and it says to be implemented. Super cool. So to implement this modal that we have in this final application, we're going to have to create a modal. So let's create that. So I'm going to go to my source folder, and inside components, I'm going to create a new file called requestModal.tsx. Once you create this, you're going to go ahead and type sjs and then dash request. And here you're going to use the request modal init snippet. And once you do so, we're going to have a look at what this really does. So if you have a look at this, it imports a couple of things from SolidJS. One of the most important one is this show. This show basically tells SolidJS whether to render this or not. And as you can suspect, we only show this modal when we have to create a new request. And once we are done, we close it. And that's what we want in this case as well, to be able to show or hide that based on a condition. For this, we are using a prop named show. And when declaring this component or when defining this component, we are using the request model props that we have just created here. So we are telling SolidJS that, hey, create a component which will receive these props. And in the props, we are defining the show variable, which is going to be a Boolean. We are going to provide a function or a prop that we need to call when we hide the modal. So it sort of hides the modal. And then we are also using a request here. And this request is right now there to basically identify if we are editing or adding a new request. And in this video, we are just talking about adding a new request. So if I save this file now, I can go ahead into my home TSX and start seeing this or start seeing the usage. So I'm going to go to my home TSX, and then right after the first div, we are going to create the request modal usage. So you can type here sjs request modal and then usage, and once you do so, you're going to see this snippet that we are going to use. So we are going to import the request modal. We're going to create a bunch of properties here so we can work with them, and that's pretty much it. So I'm going to create a signal here. So I'm going to say const, and here we can say show modal and then set show modal, and here we can say something like create signal, and this is going to be imported from SolidJS. And by default, we are going to provide the value false here. Now we need a way to actually show this modal. So here you can see that we have a button. So here on the button, we can say on click, and in here we can provide a function that just calls the set show modal to true. And that's pretty much it. Let's save this and try this out. So I'm on my app now, and if I click this plus button, you can see that now we show this modal. And if I click anywhere, it closes it. Why does it close it really? Because in the home TSX, right here, we have this div that's wrapping the request modal, and that div has this on click that sets it to false. So essentially what we are trying to do is whenever you click anywhere on the modal, you just close that right now just for testing purposes, but we are going to replace that later. Now what I want to do is I want to be able to create a button that is reusable and doesn't look like this. Because right now, if I mouse over, you can see this is how the button looks. But if I go to my final application, and if I show you how it looks here, you can see that it's different. So first off, it uses the Ionic icons. And then secondly, it is very reusable because I would also want in the future videos to be able to use them here on the header. So I don't want to repeat my code, and I can also use it like this as well. So to do that, I'm going to create an IconButton component so we can start using that. So I'm going to close these files, and I'm going to go to components, create a new file. I'm going to call this IconButton.tsx. In here, you type sjs IconButton.tsx. Now, there are going to be a couple of things that you would need to understand. First of all, it's creating a component with the IconButton props. And if you have a look at the IconButton props, you're going to look into a couple of things. First of all, which is the icon for this button? What is the type of this button? Is it reset, submit, or button? Because a button can have multiple types, and when we are using this to submit within the form, it should be submit, and respectively it would be others for different cases. Then we have a label that we are right now using as a titles, and then we have an on-click handler that we can use to trigger click actions or to manage what happens when we click this. Now when it comes to the HTML of it, it's a simple button which essentially assigns all of these things right there. But you will see that the TypeScript is not really happy with the Ion icons. And this is essentially the first time that we are using the Ion icons, so it doesn't work. And the reason for this is that SolidJS does not know what Ion icon means, and especially in the TypeScript context because it has no idea. So in order to make the linter or TypeScript happy, we are going to have to add the types for this. So in order to do that, we are going to create a new folder called types inside source folder. And inside here, we are going to go ahead and create a file called solid-js.d.ts. When we say d.ts, we are essentially defining the type. So they are type definitions. And in here, you paste this code. So we are importing from SolidJS. Then we are declaring a module SolidJS for the types to check that. And then the namespace JSX is what we need because SolidJS does not understand by default that you're using JSX, but what is an Ion icon in JSX, it has no idea. So we are defining an interface as in intrinsic elements, and in here we are defining Ion icon. And now you can see that TypeScript is happy, so it has no issues whatsoever. So that's the fix for looking at everything green rather than red line. Now that we have this, we're going to go to our home TSX, and where we have this button, we're going to replace this with the Ion icon. So we are going to delete this and type sjs, and then we can say icon button usage. And when you do so, you're going to see this code here. So we are essentially getting the icon button, providing the on click as it was before. The icon is going to be called add, and the label is add request. So I'm going to import this from the components. Let's render this. And now in the browser, you can see that we've got this button, and it looks like the final result that we wanted. And if you mouse over, you can see that it now says add request, which is good. So we can see that our component is working fine. And if I click this, you can also see that the request or the request modal is opening and closing as it was. So we are going in a good direction here. And now comes the fun part. We are going to look into solid forms, which for me was probably the toughest challenge for this whole application that I just created. And it's hard because there are so many form libraries out there that you can use, but then you would have to see which one do you understand the most, and not all of them are very much readable. And in fact, the one that I've used, it takes a bit of time to understand those. So let's get into it. So first off, what I want you to do is to install the solid forms package by running pnpm add and you say solid forms. Then make sure that you're restarting your server so we have all the packages and the bundles being ready. And now we are going to create some form elements, or actually some text fields that we can use. So just for styling purposes. So if I go to my final application, you can see that we've got these text fields, which you can see right here. And then also they are here in the detail page as well. As I said before, we are not going to look into detail pages yet, but for this form, at least you can see that we have a bunch of things that look similar, and then also we can reuse them, of course. So to create this component that takes an input and acts as a text field, we are going to create a new file inside components folder. We're going to call this text field.tsx. And inside here, you go and type sjs text field, and you will see a lot of code here. So let's actually see what's happening here. So at the top, we are importing the iForm control from solid forms, and that's pretty much it. For the solid forms, we are defining that this text field will receive a control, and that control basically provides us different functions to set a value to this text field, get the current value from text field, and also listen to any changes that might happen to this. So we are going to receive a label, placeholder, type, rows, ID, class. And as you can notice here, the rows is basically for the text area, but for the input element, it doesn't make much sense. But we are using this text field for both of those things. If the type of the element is text area, then we render a text area with all the properties that you can see here. If the type is not text area, then by default we fall back to input and we provide all the values there as well. Now you would notice that it also contains the class property and value updated. So we're using this value updated to notify the parent element whenever the value changes for this. And we are doing this on blur. So you are going to notice that on blur, on both of these components or these elements, text area and input, we call the onBlur method, which essentially provides this value up the hierarchy of whatever component is using this one. And that's how we roll. And then also you're going to notice that here, whenever the input changes, we are using the control API to mark as dirty, because that's how we can render the UI differently. For example, we know if the user has interacted with the input when it's dirty. We can also see if the input is valid or not by looking at the properties from here. So these forms, the solid forms, make it much easier for us to actually see how the user behaves with this input or the text field, and how we should render things differently based on different scenarios. And we're going to have a look at that in a bit. Now that we have rendered this, we are not going to use it right away, because we need to create a form right now. And in the end of all of these tutorials, you're going to notice that we use the form at two different places. We use that in the request form modal. So you can see name, URL, headers, method, but you're also going to see that in the detail page, because it's exactly the same form that we use in both places. So right now we need to create this form so we can reuse it in both places. But in this video, of course, we are going to use it right in the request modal. So to create the form, I'm going to go to the components folder, create a file called RestClientForm.tsx. And inside here, I'm going to say sjs RestClientForm start. So this is the snippet that we are using out of the box. Let's have a look at what this does. So by default, we are importing the interface and we are importing the component, and that's pretty much it. So this form gets a couple of things. First of all, it gets two functions on when the form is submitted and when the form is updated. In this video, we are more concerned about the form submit because we open the request modal and we submit it, and that's pretty much it. This request is also not going to be used here because this is used for the detail page, so you can ignore that. But the form submit is the most valuable thing here. And then the action button text is essentially deciding what do we show the text on the button or the submit button. So in this case, once we get the props, we are rendering a simple form element. You can see that on submit, we don't do anything at the moment. We have a class list object with conditional classes. We don't have that, but we are going to have that later. And then we just have a bunch of divs with labels and inputs. So these are very standard inputs that you see right here. And then in the end, we just have this really nice submit button that is used to submit the forms. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to just save this REST client form here. And now I'm going to use it. So I'm going to go to the request modal because we need to have this form inside the request modal. So right after the H5 here, we are going to use SJS and here REST client form usage. And that essentially adds this snippet here. So I'm going to import all of the things and let's see what is happening here. So first of all, we're using a REST client form here and we are providing two things that I mentioned. First, the action button text, which is save. So it shows the save text on the submit button. And then we have a form submit. So once you submit the request form, it is going to create a new ID for this new request that we are creating. And then it's going to just add that request just like this into the request list. So it gets the REST request and then it just adds on top of it. And then it closes the modal. So it tells the parent to close it, and that's pretty much it. Now, if I see my app, you can see that we already have all of these inputs there. Now, the functionality where if I click anywhere, it's going to close the modal, it still exists there. So if you want to not see that happening, you can just go ahead and remove the line from the code. But right now I'm just gonna keep it. So here you can see that we got the labels here, but these inputs are obviously not looking beautiful because they're not our text field. So we want to use our text field in order to actually use everything. But even before using the text field, we need to create controls because guess what? Our text field actually accepts this control, and this is how you would make sure that the entire form is working fine. So you can work with states, if the button should be disabled or not, and a bunch of other things. So we're gonna go to our REST client form and we are going to use the solid forms to create a new control factory. So how do we do that? Just after the imports, you type SJS and here you can say control factory, the form control factory. And once you do so, you're gonna see that this is a function that takes a bunch of things. So I'm gonna get all the imports so we can see this in a better form. And you can see that here we are getting two functions, create a form group and create a form control. And what this is doing is that this says, hey, this control factory is a function that returns a control group. Now this is really important, and it creates a form group that has these sort of controls. So the first control is name, and the second request parameter is actually another group. So it's a nested group. So we have something like a form group dot name, which is pointing to this, but then we also have form group dot request dot method, which is a form control. So you're going to differentiate between these things. So we have individual controls and then we have groups that sort of merge together as a group. I think that's how I can explain it. So in this case, you can see that the name control that we would have, which is going to be this one, is supposed to be required. And it would also have a validation in that case. So if I look at this, we're creating a form control. The value of this form control, which is name, is going to be of type string. This is going to be the default value for this form control. So if I go to my final application and if I hit this plus button, you can see that I get this new request automatically filled from here. If I remove this, you can see that we have this save button disabled, and that is what we want. We want this value to be required. And that's what we are doing here. We are defining as the second parameter an object which contains this configuration. We are saying, hey, the required in this case is true. So this is going to go ahead and go into the text field. And in here, it is going to take the props control required or the is required property and directly bind it with our text area or with the input when we are rendering this. Secondly, we are defining the validators, and this is really important. If we want this whole form group or this whole form to become invalid, if any of the controllers is not valid, then we need to have this validators function, which essentially takes the value whenever the user updates that. This function is going to run, is going to check, hey, do we have a name? And do we have the length of it, which means that we have a value for the name. So if we don't have a value, then we return this object which sets this as an error. So on this control, we are going to have an error is missing true. If the value is perfect and we have it and it's valid, then we just return null. So we return null in case of being valid, and we return an object with the key and value set to true. In the request form group, we have just three things. We have a URL, which is a form control of type string. Default value is empty string. We have a body with the same value, and the method by default would have a value of get. So if I open my final app, you can see that the get is already filled here. You can, however, use a select box here rather than an input, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just using this. Now that we have this form created, we need to see what we do with this. So instead of creating this form as a component or a solid component, we're going to create this as a form that uses this form control or the control factory. So you go after this control factory and then you say SJS form, and here you use REST form with control factory. Once you do so, you're going to see a snippet being pasted. And as you can see here, we have a bunch of things happening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import the with control from solid forms. And that's pretty much it. Now, if you have a look at this, we have, instead of using a component, we here have a with control function being used, because this is the entire function body, as you can see. And this is the entire function body. And we're using this function. Then it returns an object. And then inside there, we have defined this control factory that we are using from here. And then in the component, we get props. So when we use this with control function, the solid forms provides us all the props, which contains these controls. And now we can use these controls to pass them into our form or our text field, because we have this rendering function here. So what we want to do now is to go down here, cut all the form from here, and then I'm going to remove this RestClientForm from here and then replace this form. So if I save this right now, it's going to work exactly the same. We don't have any reds here. Now, instead of this form that we have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to use SJS form with text fields. And if I hit enter, you're going to see this whole snippet. And we are now using text fields in the wild. So I'm going to import this, save this, and let's check it out. So now if I open this, you can see that now we're using the text fields and all of this actually works. We have a default value for name and get. And if I remove the value from here, you can see that the button got disabled. Even though if you click, try clicking here, you're going to actually exit from here, but you can use the tab to actually reach this input at some point and try this out after doing a removal. But the form actually works in this case. Now let's have a look at the code and see what really changed. So in this case, I'm gonna close this return function, and now let's have a look at what's happening at the top. So by default, as I mentioned, this creates, or this factory creates a form group. The way you get any control of your form group is by using the controls property. So in this case, you're gonna see that, hey, we are saying, hey, get the props .control.controls, and this controls property essentially contains the value of name or the name control. So I could do something like name here, as you can see, and then request. So I'm taking out the control group here. And then for this request form group, I'm doing the same. So I'm gonna take this controls.request.controls. So I can now get these method, body, and URL, and I can try it here as well. So I can do dot, and here you can see body, method, URL, but I'm just creating some variables so I can use them easier afterwards. Now, what changed in the return function is, first, we have all of these class lists that are being applied. So we are making use of this props.control, and we are checking, hey, is the form valid? Remember that we are not talking about any individual control. We're talking about the entire form group that is returned from here. So we are checking, hey, is the form valid? Is it invalid? Is it touch, dirty? And these classes would be applied directly in there. And I'm going to show you that in just a bit. Then afterwards, if I go down, we're making use of the text field element here. And then we are providing the control for each of them. Now remember, the name is part of the actual form, which is the create form group. And we have taken that into the control group variable. So we are saying, hey, the control group dot name control is going to be passed for the name one. But the method URL body is actually in the request control group or this form group. So in here, if you go down, you're going to see that for name, we use this control group. But for URL, we use request control group dot URL and request control group dot method and body. So we are using the correct form controls for each of those text fields. Just the body text field is of type text area. The rest of them are just input. So we don't provide any types to those text fields. And that's what's happening. Finally, you're going to notice that we are using this disabled on the button or the submit button, and this is going to be when the form itself is invalid, and that's what happened. If I change my name and if I remove the name, this validator is going to run and is going to set this error, which basically makes the entire input invalid, and then we get this as disabled. Now let's actually have a look at these classes and see how they work. But in order to do so, I've got to remove the on click from home. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just remove this on click from this div in the home TSX. I'm going to save this. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this and now show you in the inspector. So if you have a look at the form right now, you're going to see that it says is valid, is untouched, is clean. So these are the classes that are being applied here. But if I click here and then if I blur, you're going to see that this is untouched is going to change. And now you can see that it says is touched and is clean is valid. But if I remove this value, you're going to see that now it says is dirty is invalid. So when we change the input, it marks it as dirty. And then since the value is not valid anymore, you're going to see that this says invalid. But if I type even one letter inside, you can see that it's valid and the button below also becomes enabled. So yeah, our form is actually working pretty good. But now how do I close this modal if I needed to cancel anything? And that's what we are going to work on next. We're going to implement our first directive within SolidJS. And a directive is something that can manipulate the UI by interacting with the DOM. And in this case, we want a directive that only closes the modal if we click outside on this background and not anywhere inside the request form at the moment. So let's create a directive. So I'm going to close all these files and I'm going to go and create a new folder. I'm going to call this directives. And inside here, I'm going to create a new file. We're going to call it click outside directive. So click dash outside dot directive dot ts. And in here you type sjs close outside directive. So you select the first one. So we are getting two things from SolidJS. The first thing that you will see here is the accessor, and accessor is something from SolidJS that gets the value of a signal. So we have an accessor and we have a setter. So in this case, the accessor is the signature of this directive, and this really means that we are checking is the directive is still existing on the UI. So what happens is that as soon as this directive is applied, we bind a click handler on the body. So we're saying that, hey, just when the request modal is opened, you quickly bind a directive and you add an event listener to the document. And then when the document sees, hey, there was a click, then you just essentially close it. But we also have this condition that, hey, this would only happen if I'm not clicking inside the place where this directive is applied. So ideally, I should be applying this directive in this request modal, not the background or not the backdrop, but this modal. So if I click inside here, it wouldn't close it. But if I click outside of that, it would close it. And that is being checked right here. Now, you would also notice that each directive has a life cycle, and we are checking this on cleanup. So when this directive is being cleaned up, or when you navigate to a different page, or when the component destroys, we basically remove the listener on the element, because as soon as we close the dialog, the request modal goes away. it goes out of the DOM, and that's why we want to remove the listener so we don't keep adding a lot of listeners in the UI. Now that we have this directive created, we want to use it. And to use it, we're going to go to our components inside the request modal because this is where we want to add it. So right after this interface, what I want you to do is to type SJS, and here you're going to say click outside usage. Now you're going to see a couple of things here which may seem weird as syntax. So just cut this one and put a semicolon after this. Now, the problem with directives is that if you want to use them on the UI, you have to create this variable somehow. And let me show you what I really mean. So if I go ahead and go to the second div here, so the first one is essentially the backdrop. The second div here is the request modal. So what I'm going to do is right after the class, I'm going to create the usage of click outside. And now I can actually import this here. So if I do something like import click outside, and here I can say from, not former, but from, and here I can say directives, and then click outside directive. Now if I try to use this click outside here, and if I use it here, you would think that, hey, SolidJS should actually make it work, but it really doesn't. First of all, the TypeScript is complaining because it doesn't understand that, but even if we fix that, it's not going to work. So let's actually see that in the wild. So in this case, it has the same issue as Icons, and that is that it doesn't understand that in JSX, you could use a use click outside. So we need to go to our types here, and inside the SolidJS DTS, we are going to add another entry. Here, we are going to say directives, and then we are saying click outside, and we are defining this as void, and that's pretty much it. Now, if I save this, you're going to see that the request modal here is happy, which is good, but let's see if this actually works. So if I go to my app here now, and if I open my inspector, go to console and try clicking the plus button, you're going to see click outside is not defined. And this is actually an issue with how the directives work in SolidJS and how TypeScript works around them. So if I click this link that you would have got from just the snippet, you're going to see the issue that was created for this. And the issue is that if you create the directive within the same file, it would work. But since I have this inside another file and I'm exporting it from there, it doesn't work. So the easiest way to actually make it work is that you basically import it with a different name and then you assign it a different name. Unfortunately, that's the case. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to rename this import to outside directive, and then you change it here to say click outside, because in the HTML we want to use click outside and the types also say click outside. That's why we have changed the import and not this const that we are using. Now it feels a bit weird to me, but I'm going to still let it go that we have a const that is not being used, and this would probably be caught into linters and whatnot. So you're going to probably have to say, hey, ignore this. But essentially if I do this now, and if I go back to my app, click this plus, you can see that now it works. And now if I go ahead and click anywhere inside, no problem. And if I click outside, it closes. Yay! So our modal is being opened and closed with the directive in SolidJS. Now the final thing that's remaining for this video is that we would like to delete the requests so we can also remove them from the UI. But even before deleting, shouldn't we really add a request? So let's actually try that. If I click the plus button, provide the values here, or even don't, and hit save, you can see that we got a new request here. And if I go to my application and see the local storage, you can see that we got the new request here with the ID and the request and whatnot. And now if I refresh, you can see that we still get those values right out of the box. So I can see them working and I can add as much as I want. So I can add 1, 2, and 3. And if I refresh, they're still going to be there. Now let's talk about deletion. How do we delete, or how do we do this? So you can see that we have a delete button that appears when we mouse over each element, and then when we delete, it's going to delete it from the UI, from the application, and also from the storage at the same time because it's synced. So for the delete item, I'm going to just close all of these, and now you need to go to the home page, and inside the for loop for each element that we are rendering, just before this closing link tag, we are going to add a delete button. So we are going to type sjs delete, and you can see here we have a request icon. So you just click this, and in here, you're going to see this snippet then. Now, what we want to do is to import this set rest request from the store. And we are going to just comment this one for the moment because it handles something with the detail view. And you can see that we are using an ion icon here. In here, we're using the stop propagation. And in here, we're checking if there are requests to delete, which I now realize that this is probably stupid because we are deleting a request, which means there should be requests to delete. But let's say we get the requests, then we filter out the request based on the ID that we want to delete. So we are deleting the particular element here, and we are setting it via the signals, and this should essentially show up on the UI as well as on the storage. And then we have this condition. I'm not going to talk about that, but then we just have some stylings that are happening right here. Now, if I go back to my application and refresh, you can see that out of the box, we get a lot of buttons, but they're all in this place. And for some reason, if I refresh, sometimes they are on the right place, but sometimes, yeah, I see them on weird places. I don't know what's happening. But if I mouse over on any of one of them, and if I click delete, they're going to be deleted. So let's actually try to go to our application so we can actually see that in real time. So in this case, you can see that we've got 6 items, with the last one being new request. And if I hit delete here, you can see that it got deleted from the storage as well as from the UI. And now the final thing we want to do is to not show them all the time, because yes, I don't think that everyone wants to delete the request all the time. So it should only be shown when you are hovering, so the user has an option, and not on every item. So for that, what I want to do is to create a new file here for styles. So I'm going to say home.css here. And then in here, you type sjs home css and hit enter. Now we're just styling a couple of things. We are hiding the icon by default. When we hover over the item, then we essentially show that. And then we just have some text or color stylings when it comes to active or non-active. Now that we have this, let's actually import this into home.tsx. So I'm going to go ahead here, and then I'm going to say import. And from here, I can say simply /home.css. And now if I go to my browser, you can see that we don't see those delete buttons anymore. And if I just hover over this, now we see them. So super cool. And you can see that all of this is persistent. All right, so I hope that you liked the video. If you did, press the thumbs up button. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. That really shows your support and helps the channel grow. And let me know in the comments, what do you want me to work on next when it comes to SolidJS or any other framework like Next.js, Nest.js. Just let me know in the comment and I'll look into it. As always, happy coding. I'm going to see you in the next video.